You're watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. I'm Catherine Bullock. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. Today, a continuing look at anti-racism efforts in Canada with an interview of the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, Mohammed Hashim. First, some news headlines. British Columbia declares state of emergency. Suspect charged with arson for Indigenous homeless shelter fire. Record 1.5 million visits to Toronto food banks in 2020. After 6 decades, Malcolm X's convicted killers expected to be exonerated. And Polish forces again attack refugees trying to enter Europe. British Columbia declared a state of emergency yesterday after floods and landslides caused by the record rainfall last weekend continues to batter the province. Mike Franworth, the Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General, says that their top priority is to get rail and roadways cleared for transport. The federal government accepted British Columbia's call for assistance and the Canadian Armed Forces are on their way. There were over 17,000 people evacuated due to flooding, with more than 9,000 properties facing evacuation orders and alerts. The state of emergency is in effect for 2 weeks and can be extended or rescinded as necessary. Michael Peter Belanger, an employee of the City of London, was charged with arson for burning an Indigenous-led homeless shelter project. Atlosa Family Healing Services, an Indigenous-led organisation, planned to transform a vacant clubhouse on a city-owned golf course into a homeless shelter for 30 people before it was devastated in a fire earlier this week. Executive Director of Atlosa, Raymond Deliri, says that the crime was an act of privilege, where individuals continue to show that they don't want Indigenous people in the city. Belanger has been suspended without pay and is set to appear in court in February. The Who's Hungry 2021 report showed that there were about 1.6 million visits to Toronto food banks last year. The record high number is 47% greater compared to visits in 2019. New clients amounted to 61% of attendees in Toronto food banks. The report found that people faced an increased cost of living and decreased access to community or social supports. The organisation is calling on the government to create more affordable housing and a social safety net to help Torontonians living in a state of crisis due to COVID-19. Mohammed Aziz and Khalil Islam are expected to be exonerated 6 decades after they were charged for killing Malcolm X. A 22-month investigation conducted by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the two men's lawyers say that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the New York Police Department withheld key evidence that could have acquitted Aziz and Islam. According to New York Times, Deborah Francois, a lawyer for the men, said that their conviction was a product of extreme and gross official misconduct. Polish forces fired tear gas and deployed water cannons against refugees trying to cross the Belarusian border early this week. There are an estimated 4,000 refugees camped along the border between Poland and Belarus, with around 15,000 Polish soldiers blocking them. The conditions there are increasingly dire, with freezing temperatures. Poland's defense ministry said on Tuesday the refugees were trying to destroy the fence and cross over into Poland. Belarusian Foreign Ministry spokesman Anatoly Glaz accused Poland of worsening the problem. At least 11 migrants have died on both sides since the summer influx, according to aid groups. That's it for the news, and now an interview with Mohammed Hashim, Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Welcome to the show, Brother Mohammed. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Now, I know that you're Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, whose aim is to eliminate racism in Canada. And you've done a recent survey as a partner with Environics Institute for Survey Research about race relations in Canada. One of the major findings was that race relations is worsening over the years. So can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do this survey with Environics?
Well, we did the survey 2 years ago as one of the benchmarks for how Canadians felt in terms of their own sense of expectation of racism here in Canada. And then over the last 2 years, we've seen a dramatic landscape shift completely in terms of how people talk or expect to talk about racism. And that's been precipitated, obviously, by the Black Lives Matter movement, by George Floyd's murder in the US, the rise in anti-Asian racism, as well as here in Canada with the with the loss of the Epstein family. All these factors have played into our understanding of how we see racism in Canada. And I don't mean just racialized Canadians, but everybody. What do we see in terms of our future outlook? How do we think we're going in the right direction, the wrong direction? Why do we think we're going in those directions? And that's why we did the survey, in order to do a comparative from 2 years ago, knowing that all that's happened in the last few years. Where are we going, and what has changed?
So if there's this renewed self-reflective focus and examples are being brought to the fore. I mean, I know I grew up white. A lot of white people don't even understand racism. So you need examples. If this is all coming out, why do you think it's worsening?
Well, awareness has gone up, and yet people feel that it's not getting better. And from when we talk to people about what the answer to that is, I think many people feel when they see racism in the news, there's an understanding that hopefully things are going to get addressed. But when they're not, people feel as though there is a sense of disappointment.
And so tell us about the survey. What kind of questions did you ask, and what was like the methodology? How did you go about it?
Well, the Environics Institute for Public Affairs did the survey for us. And what it was, there was a whole variety of questions in terms of, just your experiences around racism. It's actually a very large survey. It was about 3,700 people approximately that were surveyed across the country. We oversampled in a variety of populations, racial groups, in order to make sure that when we reflected their perspectives in the survey, that we had enough of a data sample to work with. So there was about, I think, 40 something questions around there, I believe.
I remember I actually worked with Environics when they did the first survey, the second survey of Canadian Muslim opinion. I know how much work goes into crafting the questions, but we weren't able to reach such a big sample size. So it's good that you were able to reach that many people. What is the most surprising result for you?
I don't think the survey gave us much of a surprise. I think we know that people are, and honestly, people are sick and tired of talking about race and not seeing the dial move. I think when you ask the question around why is there a sense of disappointment or a lesser sense of projection of what the outlook could be like in the future, I think it's because people are not seeing it change. People aren't seeing, or people aren't feeling the change locally. We're still seeing very elevated levels of racism in the workplace, within the healthcare system, even within policing. And I think that with additional awareness, we see that that there's an expectation for things to change, but when that expectation is not met is when the disappointment settles in. So I think the most important finding from this was that we can't just be talking about race and pointing out what's wrong. We need to see policymakers respond to that and actually come up with solutions that are actually impacting people, and not just statements in terms of solidarity.
Are you satisfied with the way that race is even discussed at the policy level. I always have a bit of a problem when I'm filling out forms. I have to identify ethnically as white, but I wear a headscarf, I experience discrimination. There's nowhere for me to put that information on any form. Race is a socially constructed category. It's not even a real thing. Are you sort of satisfied with how we're even talking about it?
No, I mean, I think what you're pointing towards is the disaggregated data around race and the noting of intersectionality. I think that those things are something that are being consistently being reviewed. I believe the British Columbia government is bringing in an act strictly around race-based data. The federal corrections system is looking at how they're collecting race-based data. I think many people are seeing the gaps that you're identifying, and are trying to figure out ways to address that by ensuring that the data that we collect is responsible, and that and tells us the truths that we need to hear.
Right. So when I was doing the Environics survey for Muslims, we actually tried to fundraise in the Muslim community to help support the research. And it was actually really hard. We weren't able to raise enough funds from the Muslim community to support it, even though it's about Muslims in Canada. One of the things we found is that this information seems so abstract. And you talked about how people, they want to see action, not conversations. So can you just tell us how you see this kind of data translating into the real world, like practical steps?
Well, there's a few things. One is we did a number of sections around policing and as well as in the healthcare system. This survey was funded by Pfizer Canada, and part of what we wanted to do was to be able to pinpoint what experiences were to individuals and their experiences of healthcare as well as policing, but also just racism in general. And what we are hoping to do is, we're a federal crown corporation, so we don't typically put out advocacy agendas in terms of what the government should or shouldn't do. However, what we do is we sit with policymakers frequently and inform them of the issues that that we see. And I think that, to be frank, I sit in a lot of these conversations within different legal environments or policy development environments. And I think that what this data does is it actually helps them frame the conversations and the perspectives that they look at these potential policy solutions are. And to be honest, there's so many different things that are happening across this country right now, from municipalities to provinces looking at how they can make it better for racialized Canadians, how they can level up the bar. And I think that the policy responses are coming, but they're just very slow in how they are developed.
And do you think that's where it starts? It starts in policy and then it trickles down into society?
I think it starts with creating a political environment, to be honest. I think that, politicians set a tone that that others follow. That if the bureaucracy doesn't feel there's a political impetus to be able to respond to something, they're going to go to where they feel there's a more urgent sense of response. And because nobody who's working in policy development is thinking about how they spend their time, they're just responding to how they need to spend their time in the immediacy. And I think that, so like politics matter. Like who you elect matters in terms of how they put this at the forefront. And I think that in order for racism to be on the agenda, I think that what I'm seeing is that many politicians, and the vast majority of Canadians and Canadian politicians are putting race on the agenda, and I think that it's being dealt seriously with across all political parties.
I mean, it's good. It's good to hear you say that. One of the things that I noticed in your press release is, if I remember it correctly, is that 1 in 5 said they'd experienced racism. That's incredibly high. So we have to wrap it up. But as we close, is there any parting words that you want to share with us? Any ideas or wisdoms or tips on how we can help this as a society change?
To be honest, I think that people need to ensure that if they see it, they report it. especially around hate crimes. Reporting of hate crimes is so incredibly low that without there being a heightened sense of awareness around that policymakers just are not taking it as seriously as they could be. So reporting is very important, but also talking to your politicians to understand, what are the possible opportunities, and people need to be able to see and feel the betterment around racism and I think some people do and some people don't, but our job is to make sure that everybody feels that there is a better tomorrow for everybody.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show today and sharing this with us.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay safe and God bless.